Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today for the Energy Innovation Pioneers discussion. Today we'll be talking about innovation in the power sector, which is particularly important because when you think about the power sector and the amount of money that goes into research and development, it might be the smallest out of all of the individual energy sectors. In upstream energy, oil and gas exploration, you might have 0.5% of all revenue going into research and development. And in power, it's probably under 1%, or at least it was in 2015. So joining me today to discuss their innovations as small startups that can bring a lot of nimble and creative ideas to market without having a lot of the regulatory burdens or constructs that prevent them from being a little bit more risk-oriented are our Energy Innovation alumni for the year. We have Paul Spencer from the Clean Energy Collective, and they are a community solar company. We have Frank von Mierlo from the 1366 Technologies Company, and they produce low-cost solar wafers. And we have Kevin Robert from M-Trigen, a company that creates a small-scale combined heat and power and cooling device that he'll talk about a little bit more. So I'd like to jump right into it and kind of talk, just about how we start up and what our thoughts on for developing innovation. And I'd like to start with Frank. Frank has an interesting experience where he had successfully exited a previous startup, and he had a mountain of cash in his basement, he tells me, and he had some entrepreneurial spirits and wanted to put them to work. So Frank, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you started 1366 Technologies?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, we had just sold my last venture, and as I tell the story, truck dumped a boatload of cash in the basement, and so I came home and my wife said, well, you've been a poor excuse for a husband, you've been a lousy father, so why don't you just stay home for a while, at least until the kids are off to college? And so that was my plan. And we tried that for about 10 weeks, and then she said, get out of the house. So that was the genesis of this next venture. But then I said, we'd earned a lot of money in the military-industrial complex, so I thought, I'm going to try to do something meaningful for the planet. And I believed at the time that global warming was one of our more serious issues. MIT was just starting its energy initiative. And then I spent about a year sort of looking at things. And it turns out that our planet gets 1366 watts per square meter of sunlight. That's our solar constant, hence the name of the company. And if you take the total energy consumption of the United States and you divide it by the area of the United States, you get less than half a watt per square meter. So 1366 watts per square meter coming in, we use less than half a watt. Now, I was never the smartest student at MIT, but it seemed to me that you can probably get this done. And so I decided to work in solar, and specifically in silicon, because that's most of the market. And we set out to revamp the silicon manufacturing process and make it a lot more efficient. Great. So that's how we got started.
Wonderful, wonderful. So you had like an innate desire to get out there and do something once your wife had told you that you needed to. Paul, you are another serial entrepreneur. How did you get Clean Energy Collective going, and what was the impetus there?
Sure. So my experience was more of a personal experience. I've built 10 companies over the last 28 years. Electrical engineering from schooling, so I remembered some of that. And about 14 years ago, my wife and I built our own off-grid home. And we didn't actually physically build it ourselves. We had someone build it, but so forth. And it was just, it's run by solar as well as wind generation. It's not connected to the grid. It's not a Ted Kaczynski cabin or anything like that. It's a normal home. But we found, my experience in it was just way too difficult, way too costly. I had a passion for it because of my background, and yet there were many avenues where my wife was like, pull in a power line and let's be done with this. And so really that was the genesis for trying to create a model. We invented community solar 9 years ago. And it was essentially just the notion of allowing anybody with a power bill to be able to engage with renewables literally from a click of a button on their mouse and they now own solar or subscribe to solar or wind or microhydro, et cetera, and really be creating that accessibility, which I felt was required in order to get the adoption that Frank is referring to as far as the amount of money we need to capitalize into renewables. Doing that $1,000 at a time, $10,000 at a time, $1 million at a time, really starts to add up when you can really create a vehicle that allows the masses to be able to participate easily.
Well, that's really interesting. So it's doing well by doing good, and also increasing consumer choice a bit there too. Kevin, you have a bit of a different experience where you were recently brought in as the CEO of M-Trigen. How do you take the founder's vision and keep the momentum going and build off of that?
Donald Williams founded our company about 10 years ago, and he's your classic, almost mad scientist type guy. Super curious, always looking forward. He had been involved in a number of startups, and he developed the technology. And I had been involved in a drill ship, DP3 drill ship construction project at Conoco in the mid-90s, where we built a 40 megawatt power plant that did cooling, heating, did everything on board the ship, and at that time using things like GPS was all serial number one. So I was building a home and met Donald, and he told me about his technology, and I realized it was exactly the same thing we had done on the drill ship, just micro-sized. Instead of 40 megawatts, this was 5 kilowatts. So I put a unit in at my new home, which was an experimental unit. And I ran it for about a year, where essentially what I did is, instead of using electricity to run my house, I generated my own electricity, cooling, hot water. I had a hot tub that I would heat up with the technology. And it became apparent to me that it produced clean, efficient energy, and it took me completely off the grid. So I got pretty psyched up, also because it burns natural gas, which, of course, I'm from the E&P business, and I'm a believer in fossil fuels and things like that. So I think I get excited because I see it as an opportunity to bring grid independence, take some of the load off of our existing electricity distribution system, and at the same time, it has impact because it can leapfrog the grid, or you can even reduce emissions with it, since you're generating your power on such a small scale.
Great. So, I imagine a big part of that is continuing to build the team. So do you have any thoughts on how you continue to build the team and bring on that innovation?
Yeah, that's probably the part that I bring to the table. Donald has we have 2 patents and 18 applications. And we think there's a portfolio of patents of about 50 plus patents. And most of them use the heat coming off of the internal combustion engine to do things like capture CO2, distill water, desalinate water, produce water, make fertilizer. There's just like a cell phone that has, once the platform was built, there's all these applications. We think we've effectively got the platform or the cell phone of the distributed electricity business. So now there's multiple applications. So Donald, while he focuses on technology, I brought in the chief financial officer, the manufacturing people, the guys you need to actually monetize each patent as it comes out. And so we're in I guess I've got the more traditional part of the company, but then we at the same time have that same challenge of startups. We're always raising money, and we're always out there trying to find people that are enthusiastic about the business. There's a huge interface with solar, LED lighting, so there's a lot of vertical markets as well that I see potential to tap into.
Great. And Frank, you had mentioned in our talks that innovation in general is really just getting a team of talented people together and setting them a goal and letting them at it. How do you find these people, and how do you ensure that they're well motivated?
So I really changed my view on that. So in the 20 years that I've done high-tech development, and my previous company was very successful and did a lot of creative stuff. And in this particular venture, we have succeeded to go from concept all the way to this year we're opening up our first commercial factory in Southeast Asia together with a strategic partner. And so that, I used to think what you want to do is you want to find that unique genius that is going to make the invention. And it turns out that that's really not the way that invention works. As human beings, we are naturally inventive. All of us are. And there is nothing more predictable than if you get a team of people to work on a specific idea, and they work on it every day, day in, day out, for 60 hours a week, after a couple of years, you will make progress. It's guaranteed. And so it's much more about, for sure you want to have talented people, but culture is incredibly important. Real innovation tends to happen between people, not so much an individual person. So you want to make sure that there's good team spirit. So the brilliant jerk that cannot get along with anybody, you should just fire. I mean, that's actually destructive to innovation, no matter how smart he or she is. You really need people to work together. And then it's about focus and vision, and then you can get there. I mean, let's not forget. I mean, we ended up going to the moon because some lawyer decided that we needed to go to the moon. I mean, that guy wasn't an engineer. But it's a matter of putting the team, creating the vision, and off you will make progress. And in our case, of course, it took a decade and $100 million, so it didn't necessarily come that easy. But we sure got there.
Well, I do think building a culture is very important. Paul, you're on more of the information technology side, which I think mean that you are competing with groups like Google's and Amazon's that have top paid engineers. How do you prevent your staff or prevent losing your staff or even attracting new staff into that environment at Clean Energy Collective?
Sure. So I think it's twofold for us. The first is we have the advantage of nearly all of our team members really enjoy what they're doing and really feel they have a purpose in what they're doing. And what I mean by that is they're making a living, but they're also doing good while they're making a living. And they all take that really personally. Whereas at Google, they might be building the next search engine or some advertisement tool or et cetera, but they really don't feel like they're saving the planet in any way. And in our case, they can feel that in some small way that they're connected to it. And they can see the progress where when we started with our first facility with a couple hundred solar panels, now we install millions of solar panels a year, what that really means to the greater good. The second is, in this particular company, all of our employees are shareholders. So, everything from the gal who runs the front desk to, actually all employees except for me are in our employee stock option pool. I obviously own shares outside of that. But it also just gives them the personal ownership and the personal benefit and upside of being included in something that they're making that's making a difference and being a very profitable business.
Oh, very nice, very nice. So I know that reliability has been one of the bugaboos that haunt the renewable sectors. What are your thoughts about community solar and its greater role in the grid and in providing reliable supplies of power to load servers?
Yeah, so certainly you have intermittency in nearly all renewables, I guess minus maybe geothermal or biomass, things of that nature. And I think it points to, which you're seeing the solutions already, is it ends up bundling up with other technologies. So you look at bundling it up with gas generation or something of that nature that can take those downtimes within solar or downtimes within wind. Obviously, one of the hopeful long-term equalizers to that will be storage. We'll see, it's going to take some time before storage can get to the scale as well as the price point that makes sense. But we installed solar on a community solar installation in Minneapolis, Minnesota, of all places, 6 years ago. It was terribly expensive, didn't make a heck of a lot of sense, but it was a proof of concept. And today, like if you look at 2018, nearly all of our systems going into the Northeast, Massachusetts, and so forth are being designed with fairly large scale storage. So I think that's storage as well as just the yin and yang between renewables and non-renewables are really the shorter term and longer term solution. I would say the yin and yang is more the shorter term solution as opposed to the longer term solution. As battery storage does come down and is more affordable, that certainly takes out the intermittency that you're going to get from a renewable source.
Right. Kevin, I know that your product has some very good reliability purposes. Do you see that being a major driver of further adoption, or is it really just the compelling economics?
Yeah, I do. I mean, our system unlike a backup generator that is an insurance policy, our system actually saves a home or a business between 30 and 70% of their electricity costs. But I think to add on to what Paul was saying, the ability to interface it with any kind of renewable energy, and now because we have storage, that renewable technology is available all the time. You're getting the maximum out of it. So we have an installation in Northwest Houston where we've installed 144 kilowatts of solar panels. We've taken 24 of our appliances, networked them together to provide 144 kilowatts of power generation. And then we've got 120 tons, which is equivalent to about 600 kilowatts of electricity of air conditioning. When you add the battery storage, the panels can basically charge the batteries all the time, that the panels are receiving sunlight, and you take about a megawatt of power off the grid. So to me, that's the exciting part. It's not only the basic technologies, but when you put them together, and we didn't even do LED lighting. Had we done LED lighting, it would have even been better. The ability to put all that together and have the data services and the ability to use your cell phone to measure energy in, energy out, do I want to sell back, do I not, is really to me where we're going. It's an Internet of Things, energy cloud type application, using all of these individual, almost industrial type solutions. Because there is, unlike software as a service, we're actually, all of us are building products. So to me, that's the real exciting thing going forward.
Great, and you mentioned, there's all these convergences of technologies in your product. Do you see any that are, just on the horizon that you think are going to be brought in next?
I think fuel cells are interesting, and maybe it's kind of what Paul was getting to. The more we develop the technology to store energy and reuse it instead of just losing it, our basic concept is the realization that when you air conditioning a space like this space right now, somewhere there's a fan pumping hot air into the atmosphere. That hot air represents energy. So think of electricity being generated from any renewable. If you're not able to capture it and reuse it, then it's by definition wasted energy. So I think any of these technologies coming that enhance storage can be modularized. Our footprint of our device is 5.5 feet wide and 3 feet deep, so it's very small. And I think that's the other innovation, is a lot of the things we're talking about have been limited to really large scale. So with technology, you can micro-size it and get it down to where even us as individual consumers can take advantage of these things.
This is very interesting. Well, more broadly, I want to take a step back and think about what challenges do you find or do you face when you're looking for funding, when you're starting up these companies? And anyone on the panel, please jump in. What challenges have you faced?
So for us, we started out with an A round where we raised $12 million, and we did that relatively quickly. It was a couple months. We had 20 slides. I printed them out on paper and laminated them so I could sit across the table from somebody and didn't have to turn on an overhead projector. We raised that first round just purely on reputation. I mean, we had a good team, industry experts, and there was a strong link to MIT. I had just made a ton of money for my previous investors, and so that first step was just built on previous reputation, and they invested in the team. We then were very lucky. We had 4 term sheets, and we picked the most competent group of VCs. And so that when you think about raising money, your A round, who you dance with is incredibly important, because some of us are very optimistic and they say, with the A round, we're immediately going to go to IPO. That doesn't happen. So you're going to have a B round, a C round, and so it's very important that you pick investors that are willing to continue to support the venture, provided, of course, you make good technical progress. And in our case, it was the steady technical progress and the continued support of the original investors that made subsequent rounds possible. And then you got to get the story out. And at some point, you got to start dancing with people from industry because you get validation there.
All right.
And so in the later rounds, it's actually the big industrials that come in, and they invest in part because they believe in your technology. And so that's for us yeah, well, a little over $100 million. 40 million of that was non-dilutive. The rest of it was equity. And this year we're going to be cash flow positive. And I see my way to profitable orders next year. So hopefully I'm finally done with this.
So, Paul, Kevin, how do you pick your VCs?
Yeah, no, so I think it is important, especially in the early rounds, you need someone who is flexible and who's going to really be there for the long term and believes in what you're doing and why you're doing it and the team behind it and so forth. For this particular venture for me, CEC, it was harder than other ventures that I've been involved with just because we were inventing a market space. So literally my presentation started with explaining what community solar was because there weren't any examples of it. Mm-hmm. And luckily we were able to do the early rounds, similarly, based on past experience and showing that, we didn't always have dumb ideas and this should work out and so forth. But it definitely, even to this day, it's a lot of education. I mean, I think a lot of people have heard the buzzword community solar, don't know what it is. More people don't have any, I've never heard the word, even though it's been around for 9 years and it's now the quickest growing segment in solar.
Well, for the sake of our audience, do you want to explain real
quick?
Sure,
so no one has to raise their hand that what the heck are you talking about? So community solar is essentially building medium-sized solar facilities. So call it anything between a 5 and maybe 50-acre site full of solar.
Okay.
So you've driven by solar plants that look like this. The difference is that we then allow anybody in the local area to be the actual subscribers to those panels. In some cases they own the panels, in some cases they're just subscribing to it like cable TV. And they then get credited for the power that's produced by those panels directly on their utility bill, similar to if they had it on their roof. But they don't have it on their roof. We're building it at scale, thousands of panels at a time, much lower price point. And we're maintaining it for them perpetually as part of the deal. Right. So that's all built in. So you don't have to worry about, something went wrong or, the Northeast storm last week knocked out 7 of our arrays. We got trees on top of solar panels. Right. Well, we take care of that. And as a result, it also makes it portable in that a consumer can sell their interest at any time to anybody else in the local utility area. So it becomes quite flexible. And so as a result, our customers are anything from low to medium income families who might have a single panel and might be building over time to large state, federal, and local governments who might have hundreds of thousands of panels with us, or at least thousands of panels. And of course, big corporations, et cetera, that are finding this to be a really easy way for them to adopt renewables but not have to deal with any of the headache and yet be able to do it at a price point that makes a lot of sense as far as return.
That's a very flexible business model. I was thinking, Kevin, with your particular product, you want to position it at smaller sites like gas stations, restaurants, things like that. How does your business model allow these smaller sites to maybe not make a huge capital outlay on electricity generation?
It's a good question. Up till now, we've spent a very small amount of money, and it's all been from friends, family, and employees, about $7 million to get the company to where it is now. So we're actually in the middle of our first Series A raise. Oh. And I think our challenge is finding the investor. It's probably not going to be an institution because I don't think institutional investors look at companies like us, which is one of the negatives of the venture capital and private equity area. But finding the guys with the vision that understand what could be and then willing to put some money into it is probably our challenge. I think as we go forward, a leasing model of our equipment, very much like you've seen a GE Capital or something like that, would explode the availability of the equipment to residential service because our price point for a home could be anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000. So there's not that many people that already have a home are going to want to shell that out, but they might look at a lease. So that would be another raise because maybe like right now we're out looking for $15 million in order to basically commercialize the technology. If you went into a leasing program, pick a number, how much you want to deploy, you could deploy hundreds of millions if you wanted to. And I think that would be a completely different group of people, but that would certainly explode the availability of the equipment.
It's interesting. It's interesting. So, one of the things that I'm picking up on is that venture capital doesn't really love the energy sector and doesn't really love the power sector quite as much. Our returns are a bit lower than the Silicon Valley might get you when you double your money in 3 to 5 years in some cases. So, one of the things that a previous panel had discussed is that what we really need to do to drive a lot more investment or excitement in this field is to have some good exits, some exits where people get out and they make a bit of money. Paul, Frank, you've exited already. How do you know when to leave?
Yeah, I think it comes in two ways. Either, in my experience, either one, there's an offer that you're like, wow, that just sounds really good. Mm-hmm. The other is you come to a point potentially as an individual where you feel like you want to go do something else, and so then you look for the exit. So one, the exit hits you in the head. The other one, you look for the exit. I don't think any of us would disagree that great exits would be fantastic, because that's we're on the exit side. And I do think it would be good for attracting, the same session I was at as well. It would do well to attract more entrepreneurs to be able to get into the space and be able to grow new solutions, which I think certainly the energy space is challenged for, because they are such large businesses that they're really focused on their core business, which is appropriate. They don't really have time for the pet projects that might actually demonstrably change their business going forward.
Right. Frank, any thoughts on that?
For me, it's never been about the exit. I start companies because I like building stuff, and in this company in part because I want to keep my marriage together. But it's not about the exit. But I do, of course, in the end, you have this romantic fantasy that you start your company because now you're going to be independent and you don't have a boss anymore and all that stuff. Well, that's not the way it works out. Certainly in our case, when you've raised that much money, you just work for the investors. So I report to my board of directors. At the end of every board meeting, there is an executive session where they decide whether to keep said executive. And by the way, I leave the room for that session. And so, I have a job until the next board meeting, and I just have to earn that job. And so it is my responsibility to get a return for the people who invested. And I see a real path where, at least for the A-round investors, we can get a 10x return on their investment. I think we're well on our way to do that, to doing that. So with a bit of luck, I can deliver that exit that you were looking for.
Right.
Listen, we invented a new manufacturing process. Silicon wafers is a $10 billion industry. It's growing quickly. We cut the cost by half. We cut the energy payback on a wafer by a factor of 3. This really has the potential to revolutionize a big part of the sector and makes the entire solar panel more efficient in the way that it pays back the energy much quicker. We get energy payback to less than a year for a panel that tends to last 20, 30, 40 years. So this is, there's the possibility here to build a large company, for sure.
I come out of the E&P business. I spent about 34 years there, and I was fortunate enough to be on 3 public company management teams where we exited. And in that business, as you know, it's extremely cyclical. So my view on the calculation of multiples and exit values is a great way to look at a business where you know it's going to have cycles. I think as we look at the energy business going forward, and specifically electricity generation, it's not as cyclical a business because it's very steady growing demand. And there's not a commodity exchange that's trading the commodity and therefore taking positions in it to create quite a fluctuation. And also, you don't have the same political impact like you do in the oil and gas business and the electricity business. So I think another paradigm on exiting, it's a good paper exercise to say, hey, if I IPO'd, how do I value the company? But there's another way to look at it, and that's cash flow. It's a very old-fashioned thing, but with what we're doing, we have set up our first manufacturing facility for a total cost of about $50,000. If you're looking for a return on equity, it's kind of a crazy number to think about because it doesn't make sense on paper. So I think instead of thinking about an exit where you sell out, I think we can generate businesses that are very strong dividend payers, and effectively the investors are rewarded by that vehicle, and then if they want to exit, they can sell their shares, and if the value of the company is going up that direction. But I think the key in our area is continuing to develop technology. If you develop a single product and get to a stopping point, you're going to have value erosion because other people will come in and figure out how to do it better, cheaper, etc. So I think the key is much like Walt Disney, when he figured out he was going to invent animation, he also figured out he was going to do comic books, movies, Disneyland. He had an innovation plan, which was a value creation plan, not a strategic plan. And I think that's the other way to look at this, is innovation needs to have a plan that is going to continue to innovate, and the value will come from those products. And if you do that, I don't think you ever have to worry about exiting because you're going to be generating healthy business, and you'll effectively be exiting through the dividends and the cash flow you're generating from the business.
Well, the Disney Corporation certainly has a wonderful business model of integrated value creation. And staying hungry is definitely an important point. You mentioned when you started that you had a lot of friends and family and directors come on board and write checks and help you finance.
Right.
What are your thoughts on how you set up your board of directors, and how do you ensure that they help you stay hungry?
Yeah, of course, we certainly have a strong founders presence on our board, but we're just now starting to bring on what I'll call a true independent board member. And those individuals that we're looking for have the corporate experience and the ability to look down the road and think about how to preserve the value without getting diluted and the things that you worry about when you're a small company having to go through a Series A, B, C. So I think as you start to move in the direction of raising money, you need to bring on people that have experience and have the ability to protect you from yourself primarily, from making the wrong decision. So that's what we're doing right now. And I've got a management team that's composed of people that are knowledgeable about the industry, but not necessarily the entrepreneurial part. They're the guys that are the executors. And so I think you set the company up like you're going to go public, but you recognize that an innovation company is not like a typical manufacturing company or an oil company or something else that's going to go through a public, measurable growth profile.
And Paul, your board, how did you set them up, or how did you arrive at the current board configuration?
Yeah, so the current board configuration was more set up via the investors who came in at various times. So it's more of a board that represents the investors as opposed to an independently selected board. So we have board members from both our initial founders round, our A round and B round. That's as far as we've gone and as far as we intend to go. And that's actually been a really good composition because our A round was venture capital, I'd say venture capital light. I mean, not necessarily very strong venture capital mindset, but they're venture capitalists. And then our B round was strategic. So it was other big companies in the solar business that could really, lend their experience to us. In our case, it was specifically First Solar, the largest cap value solar company in the world as far as value. And so that really made for good board members from an experience perspective that then didn't really force us to go out and look for people who knew the business, or at least knew the business the adjacent businesses that we're in.
Okay, so a little bit of investors, a little bit of strategic partners. Frank, have you been bringing on strategic partners as you've developed, or?
No. We did things a little bit different. So we have a 7-member board. The A round investors each have a seat. Then we have 4 independent directors, and then I'm in there as the CEO founder. So we actively resisted any board presence by strategic investors because I think they're conflicted, and so we just simply said no to that. We're very lucky with our A-round investors. I mean, terrific. Carmichael Roberts represents Northbridge. He is arguably the most accomplished VC in Boston. Dr. Amir Nashat represents Polaris, and he didn't start Polaris, but I think he's probably one of their most talented partners at the moment. He's very active there. He's still a relatively young guy, truly brilliant, has done a lot of successful exits, a lot of them in life sciences. And then, I spend about a third of my time recruiting, and so recruiting board members is a similar sort of exercise. I identified this one guy who happened to live in Norway, who had built a wafer company that had a $10 billion IPO, and I said, well, I want to do wafer company. Why don't I get him for my board? And then I did. You can do all this great stalking on the internet, so I get all of this information about this character. And I, my HR director remembers me sitting there at my desk with a picture of this individual, and he didn't know me from Adam. And I finally managed to get a meeting, and he said, yeah, sure, come meet me. And this was like 2 days before Christmas, and he's in Oslo. And so you then got to jump on a plane and be there. And I pitched, and I said, come look at us, and he ended up coming, and he ended up joining. So he's our industry expert. I have a similar story for all of them. I won't tell all four, but let me just tell Bruce's story. Bruce Sohn is our manufacturing expert. He invented Copy Exact at Intel. Intel is a powerhouse when it comes to high-tech manufacturing. And this is the guy who invented Copy Exact. So wow, and on top of that, he was president of First Solar for a while. And whatever you might think of First Solar, they have been really good at execution. And so I said, Bruce is the guy. And he also was an MIT alum, so how can what's not to like? And so I pitched to Bruce, and this is a little bit similar to how I got married. I ended up proposing to my wife 7 times. She kept saying no until she finally said yes. Bruce, same story. He met me. He said, forget it. I'm under I'm a non-compete from First Solar. I can't do it. A little bit later, his non-compete was expired. He goes, your stuff will never work. I can't do it. But we kept making progress after progress, and at some point it was like it will never work was sort of becoming a hollow argument, and in the end he ended up joining, and he's been terrific. I mean, he just really brings that manufacturing overview. So he works with our engineers. He regularly does an audit of the entire company, and so these strong independent board members. That each come with their own domain expertise are really valuable, and you gotta fight for them. It doesn't come easy. It's like recruiting, all recruiting. You gotta go find the talent, and then really try to get the order.
So Kevin, were there any areas where you repeatedly, were banging your head against the wall, and then you finally had a breakthrough that really drove the business or brought in the talent?
I think our challenge is we're afraid we've been under the radar screen until now. We're starting to come out of that on purpose, and we've resisted getting out there until we were sure that we could put the technology out there because we're afraid of being overwhelmed. And so I think if you want to say banging your head against anything, it's making sure that you have a product that is like a commodity to the consumer. And so you have to think about reliability, service. And in our business, we want our equipment to be able to put out there and service by any HVAC technician that's out there. So I'd say the biggest challenge is making sure that underlying infrastructure works and is there to support the product.
So simplicity and reliability.
Right.
Making sure you're not getting ahead of the gun and putting a product out there.
Yeah, we're not using any serial number 1 components, and our technology is very similar to what if you pulled the engine out of your car with the batteries, the alternator, and the AC compressor, and then put it in a metal box. So it's not, something people can't work on. But at the same time, if you're without power or cooling, you're very annoyed, regardless of the reason. And so when we put our technology in a business or a home, it needs to have that kind of reliability.
Okay. Paul, you have a product where you're dealing with multiple third parties. How do you ensure reliability when you can't control what's happening at the fringes of your product?
Sure. for our basis, we oversee all of that. We spec all of it, so it's all built to spec, and then it's maintained to spec. So it's actually pretty controllable for us, even though the one piece of the business that we don't do directly is actually constructing solar facilities. So we indirectly, employ thousands of people who are building solar arrays, but we have a certain quality control over what they do to our specification, and then we oversee it. And then we typically have longer-term maintenance contracts where they're maintaining it to our spec, which makes them particularly interested in doing it right the first time.
Right.
They're on a fixed contract to keep it running.
Okay.
So we mitigate that fairly easily, even though it's a large piece of our business that we don't directly have hands-on, as far as we don't own wrenches and screwdrivers and things of that nature.
Okay. Well, Frank and Kevin, you're in the process of scaling up a manufacturing procedure. How do you ensure, supply chain stuff and your quality is ensured throughout this scaling?
First thing we're doing is making sure our technology, when it's assembled, is done with sub-assemblies that are built by people that are experts at wiring or cooling or whatever the sub-assembly is. And in fact, our product goes together in about 6 basic pieces, of which we don't build any of them. They're built and then brought in. Therefore, as long as you have a little bit of warehouse space, you can assemble these. So having that kind of cold cocked and then be able to put out, there's a lot of very, very qualified, both in the United States as well as Asia, Canada, Mexico, people that are already assembling Generac generators, washing machines, plenty of appliances that basically look like ours. So as we tap into that existing infrastructure, there's already the supply chain management, the quality control, and those kind of things. So I think the key here is not to reinvent the wheel, but take advantage of the people that are already doing that. And if you follow that industry as products cycle in and out, they're always looking for something else to keep their labor force busy. So it's a good thing to look at going into.
Okay. And Frank?
Yeah, I can echo that. I think what you just said, don't reinvent the wheel, is a really important mantra. So you have to do that on multiple levels. But when it's possible to stand on the shoulders of somebody else and previous experience, you absolutely got to do that. And you got to do that within your team as well. So marry sort of the young enthusiasm and a raw intellect with real industry experience. And sometimes it's okay to put a young guy in charge of an older guy. But you want to have both. How you organize that's a different story. But you absolutely want to have both, so you can benefit from everything that came before you, and then add your special things that make you sit. But reliability and execution is really what you're talking about. Is very much about creating the right infrastructure for yourself within your team and with your suppliers.
Okay, and then I think I want to wrap up with just a couple of more thoughts. But one of the pervading questions that I've noticed at many of these panels has been a discussion about regulatory headwinds, particularly tariffs are a common theme these days. So there are some solar tariffs. How does that impact your business, and what do you think about moving forward with that regime or changing it?
Yeah, so I could probably start there. It certainly has a negative impact. It drives up cost, which then drives up the cost of power, which then makes it less attractive for people to look at renewables. In our business in particular, we have really strong margins within solar, meaning not within solar broadly, but our particular type of solar has strong margins. And so it's not overcomable, meaning it's a speed bump for us. But it's certainly negative. I think the one thing that you do see is that nearly all renewable energy policy is set at a state level, not a federal level. And as a result, the federal level is setting tariffs. And I would say almost lock and step, you see the states going the opposite direction and setting policies that are more advantageous for renewables, to be able to attract more renewables at a state level. So it's a bit of a counteracting balance. But certainly longer term, I think that having clean, cheap power for everybody, whether it's a consumer or a business or the economy, is very, very beneficial. And hopefully hopefully that wisdom will ring through to those that are making longer term policies.
So primarily it's important to have a solid core business that is solid without that, or
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you can insulate yourself from it, that's the best. That's our situation. I wouldn't say that we deliberately tried to do that. We just tried to be as profitable as we could, and it ends up we can then absorb things that are less than desirable, like a 30% tariff on solar panels.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to wrap up with just one more thought. Currently, about 1% of people either self-generate through solar panels or on-site generation. Where do you think that number is going to be in 10 years? And I'm going to ask everyone on the panel the same question.
So I would predict, first I should say, it's taken us this long in history to get to 1%, just to put that in context.
Okay.
Within 10 years, as far as self-generation, I think it's still in the single digits, but it's probably approaching 10%.
Okay.
I think, but caveat, on a larger basis, people who aren't self-generating but utilities who are engaging renewables and so forth will absolutely be double-digit, 20, 30, 40% within that period of time. So it's really, I think, in looking at the benefit of renewable energy and the adoption thereof, it's the combination of those two that really makes a lot of sense. And ideally, the power industry, and they're showing this already, are doing a better job gravitating towards renewable energy solutions. Then their consumers don't have to self-generate because the consumers are, somewhat pleased then that their energy is being renewable.
Okay.
So it's self-generation. Otherwise, is just more of a personal desire, and you don't. In my experience, and I self-generate my home in Colorado. You don't find a lot of people who have the desire or conviction to self-generate to the tune of shelling out tens of thousands of dollars to accomplish that. And that then becomes the obstacle. Thus why I think most of the growth within renewables will happen at the power distribution level, not at the individual level.
All right. And Frank, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's very thoughtful. I mean, if you look at the economics today, utility-based solar is less than $1 a watt. But if you do that in a personal home, then the cost is going to be anywhere from $2 to $4 a watt. So if you look at capex, and capex is pretty important, utility-based PV is just simply much more effective. And then you look at other parts of the solution. You often, it makes sense to combine solar with wind, so you get a little bit more sort of availability. And then you want to solve storage. I mean, today, clearly, the best solution is to do solar wind on one end, and then to solve your storage with combined cycle gas turbine, which is very reliable and you can turn on and off quickly. And together, that today is by far the cheapest form of power and very clean. In the future, we're going to move to large-scale storage solutions, but the emphasis there is on large scale. So I don't see us moving away from utility power grid. I believe it will become more distributed, but I think in the future, more than 90% will still be utility-based.
All right.
Yeah, I saw some statistics the other day that in the United States there's about 145 million electric customers. The grid is fragile, aging, it's vulnerable to weather shutdown. There's a growing cyber terrorism and vandalism threat. There's a serious concern in some areas of the world just due to a lack of capacity, because every time we electrify more, we need more electricity. So I think the answer to the question is driven, as always, out of necessity. As people realize more of the risk that they have, they'll look to solutions. I think you can look to the backup generator space and see how that has evolved, and recognizing that is really not a very good solution. It doesn't help the environment. It doesn't provide a permanent solution. I'm going to say north of 20% within 10 years. But then I think a good portion of that will actually be technologies that allow you to be grid independent. If you look at the percentage of consumers that might actually have some kind of renewable or self-generating, I think in 10 years it may be closer to 50%, because I think we're going to have a big acceleration in the liability that we all face in depending on the electric grid. It's not going to go away. It's the largest, U.S. electric grid's the largest interconnected machine in the world.
Yeah.
It's got hundreds of thousands of moving parts. Something that happens in California affects the rest of the machine, and vice versa. So I think out of necessity, a lot of people are going to start looking to solutions, and if the solutions are available, they're going to be implemented.
All right, well, there we have it. We have from 10% to 50% will be self-generating. So if you want to learn more about how these companies are going to be, or individuals are going to be self-generating, I encourage you to join our Energy Innovation Pioneers at their pod sessions later on today from 10 to 11:30. But otherwise, I'd like everyone to join me in a warm round of applause for our pioneers.